July 1943, New Georgia Island, Solomon Chain. The jungle hung thick and wet, every branch dripping, every shadow holding teeth. Sergeant Calvin Rowe crouched beside an M22 flamethrower. 18 liters of gasoline and rubber oil, 25-meter range, 30 kilograms of potential hell strapped to a man's back. The mission was simple on paper. Clear Japanese positions dug into coral caves. But the manual said nothing about an enemy who'd never seen portable fire, who had no word for what was coming, who would soon call his Marines demons. The Japanese held 3 miles of ridgeline in bunkers that swallowed grenades and spat bullets. Every cave was a tomb waiting to be filled with American dead. The Corps promised this new weapon would change the math, reduce casualties, end the stalemate. Rowe wasn't sure. He'd seen too many promises burn up in the Pacific heat. Still, he checked the seals, tested the pressure, and watched his men practice with a weapon that turned its operator into a walking bomb. Someone had to go first. Someone always did. Calvin Rowe grew up fixing tractors on a Kansas farm, where the only explosions were backfiring engines and his father's temper when the wheat came in short. He knew angles before he knew algebra, could calculate distance by shadow length, understood that every mechanical system had a weak point if you looked long enough. The Marines recruited him in '41 for his hands, not his trigger finger. By '42, he was in combat engineer school, learning to blow bridges and clear mines. By '43, he was in the Pacific, watching friends die in ways the Kansas wheat fields never prepared him for. Jimmy Cordero burned in a half-track outside Guadalcanal when a Japanese tank round caught them at a river crossing. Rowe pulled 2 men out but couldn't reach Jimmy. The screaming stopped after 30 seconds. The smell lingered for weeks. Frank Yoshida stepped on a mine near a coconut grove and simply wasn't there anymore. Just red mist and ringing ears and a boot with a foot still in it. After Frank, Rowe stopped believing in luck. He started believing in patterns, in understanding how things worked so you could predict how they'd fail. He carried a pocket notebook everywhere, sketching Japanese fortifications, noting fields of fire, measuring angles. Other Marines called him the Professor because he'd spend an hour studying an enemy position before recommending where to place charges. His lieutenant called him Careful. Rowe called it staying alive. He didn't talk much, didn't drink much, didn't write home much. What would he say? That he spent his days figuring out the best way to kill men hiding in holes? That he was becoming very, very good at it. When they handed him the flamethrower specifications, he read them 3 times. Maximum effective range, 25 meters. Duration of continuous discharge, 10 seconds. Weight, 68 pounds loaded. Failure rate in tropical conditions, unknown. That last line bothered him most. Unknown meant someone would find out the hard way, and that someone would probably be one of his men. He studied the weapon like he'd studied his father's tractor engine, looking for the breaking point, the thing that would go wrong at the worst possible moment. The Japanese defenses on New Georgia made Guadalcanal look like a picnic. They'd learned from earlier defeats, gone underground, built a maze of coral caves connected by tunnels barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. Each position had 3 or 4 firing ports, covered with palm fronds and sandbags. Grenades rolled back out. Satchel charges got tossed back before they exploded. Small arms fire just ricocheted off coral that was harder than concrete. The standard approach, pin them down with machine guns, then rush with explosives, cost 3 or 4 Marines per bunker. The math was brutal and simple. The regiment had mapped 47 fortified positions between them and Munda Airfield. At the current rate, they'd lose 150 men taking them, assuming the Japanese didn't reinforce. Colonel Hartwick had already lost 2 companies trying to brute force through. Now he was willing to try anything, which is how experimental weapons ended up in combat before anyone really understood them. The M22 arrived in 3 crates on July 15th, carried ashore by a supply detail that treated them like they contained nitroglycerin. Maybe they did. Rowan opened the first crate and found the weapon broken down into components: the wand assembly, the fuel tanks, the ignition system, the harness. The manual was 30 pages of technical specifications and 5 pages of actual operating procedure. It smelled like bureaucracy and untested theory. The second crate held replacement parts and tools. The third held fuel, 40 gallons of a mixture that smelled like gasoline and burning rubber had a baby. Rowe had seen flamethrowers in newsreels from North Africa, big, clumsy things that needed 2 men to operate. This was supposed to be portable, a one-man system. He hefted the loaded tanks. Portable was a generous description. The operator would be carrying 68 pounds in 100-degree heat through jungle terrain, while Japanese shooters took target practice at the most visible, slowest marine in the company. Rowe spread the components on a tarp and began studying them. The fuel tanks were steel, which meant they'd rust in the humidity unless properly maintained. The seals were rubber, which meant they'd rot. The ignition system ran on a small electrical charge, which meant it'd fail when wet. The pressure regulator looked flimsy. The wand valve had 6 moving parts that could jam. He started a list of problems in his notebook, filling 3 pages before he even assembled the weapon. By the time he'd run it through his first test fire at the beach, the list had grown to 11 items. For 1 week, Rowe and his men worked 18-hour days preparing the flamethrowers for combat. The seals needed special grease, rated for tropical heat. Regular grease turned to liquid soup above 90 degrees, and New Georgia rarely dropped below 95. They requisitioned synthetic grease from a Navy supply ship, the kind used on torpedo tubes. It worked, mostly. The rubber hoses deteriorated so fast in the sun that Rowe ordered them stored in the shade and swapped out before each operation. Some genius back in the States had used standard rubber. Rowe switched to vulcanized hoses, scavenged from a downed B-17's hydraulic system. The fuel mixture was another problem. Straight gasoline burned too fast, flashed and disappeared like a magic trick. Impressive but useless against a bunker where you needed sustained heat to make it uninhabitable. The manual called for adding fuel oil to thicken it, make it stick and burn longer. Rowe experimented with ratios, burning test patterns into sand, and timing how long they stayed lit. 7 parts gasoline to 3 parts oil seemed optimal, burning for 45 seconds, with enough viscosity to splash into openings and around corners. Training was rushed because the regiment was moving out whether the flamethrowers were ready or not. Rowe had 2 days to turn infantrymen into specialists. He picked 6 volunteers, men who'd proven steady under fire, then explained what they'd be carrying. 3 backed out immediately when they saw the fuel tanks. Rowe didn't blame them. He replaced them with men who were either braver or dumber. Sometimes it was hard to tell the difference. Corporal Davis, a farm kid from Iowa, took to it naturally. Private Chen from San Francisco had steady hands. Private Morrison from Texas had balls bigger than his brain, which made him perfect for a job that required walking toward machine gun fire while carrying an incendiary device. They practiced at the beach for hours, learning to gauge distance, to hold the trigger for 3 to 5 second bursts, to move laterally after firing to avoid return fire. The weapon kicked when it discharged, not like a rifle, but like someone shoving you backward. The heat blast could singe eyebrows from 6 feet away. The noise was distinctive, a deep, whooshing roar that announced your position to everyone within 100 yards. Rowe drilled them on a simple doctrine: approach to 15 meters, under covering fire. Discharge a burst into the opening. Move immediately. Let riflemen mop up anyone who ran out. He paired each operator with a rifleman whose only job was to keep the operator alive. The pairing was essential because once you squeezed that trigger, you were committed. You couldn't dive for cover or return fire. You were a turtle carrying a bomb, slow and vulnerable, and hoping your buddy's aim was better than the enemy's. They practiced the routine until it was muscle memory, but muscle memory couldn't prepare them for what would happen when the fire reached into a cave and men started screaming. The company moved out before dawn on July 20th, under a sky that promised rain. The jungle was loud with birds and insects, sounds that would disappear the moment shooting started, replaced by the terrible silence that preceded violence. Rowe's squad carried 2 flamethrowers, 30 yards between them for safety, trying to spread out the risk. Every man knew that if Japanese spotters identified the flamethrower operators, they'd concentrate all fire on those 2 points. It made the operators feel like they had targets painted on their backs, which they did. Visibility dropped below 20 meters as they moved inland from the beach. The jungle wasn't like forests back home. It was claustrophobic, everything pressing in, every line of sight cut short by vegetation or terrain. You couldn't see the enemy until you were practically on top of them, which is how they liked it. The Japanese were masters of the close ambush, of letting you walk into range before opening up. The company moved slow, scouts out front, every man watching for tripwires and spider holes, and the 1,000 other ways this place could kill you. First contact came at 800 hours. A burst of machine gun fire from an invisible position sent everyone diving into the mud. Rifles cracked in response, shooting at muzzle flashes and shadows. Grenades thumped. Someone yelled medic. The familiar chaos of jungle combat washed over them. Lieutenant Wallace crawled up beside Rowe and pointed through the trees. There, dug into a coral outcrop, was a network of caves connected by trenches. Smoke from the Japanese weapons drifted through firing ports. It looked impregnable. They tried grenades first. 3 Marines crawled forward and lobbed them into the largest opening. The grenades exploded inside, dirt and smoke billowing out. When it cleared, the machine gun opened up again. Either the grenades had missed the defenders, or the position was deeper than it looked. Wallace called up the mortar team. 6 rounds dropped on and around the position, explosions walking across the hillside. When the dust settled, the machine gun fired again. The bunker system was too well designed, too deep, too protected by coral that was tougher than steel. Wallace looked at Rowe. "Your show, Sergeant. Let's see if that thing works." Rowe signaled Davis forward. The corporal came up carrying the flamethrower, breathing hard from the weight and the heat. His backup, Private Mitchell, moved with him, rifle ready. Rowe pointed out the main cave opening, 40 meters away. Too far. They'd need to close to half that distance, and every step would be under potential fire. The rest of the squad laid down covering fire, bullets snapping into the hillside around the Japanese position. Davis started forward, crouched low, weapon heavy on his back. 15 meters from the cave mouth, he stopped, went to one knee, and aimed the wand. Davis pressed the trigger. For a half second, nothing happened. Then the weapon roared to life, and a stream of liquid fire arced through the air. It hit the cave opening dead center, splashed across coral, poured into the darkness. The fire was different from anything movies had prepared them for. It was thick, rolling, almost alive. It found every crack and crevice, spread like a living thing seeking fuel. Black smoke boiled out of the opening, followed by heat so intense that Marines 30 meters away felt it on their faces. The Japanese reaction was immediate and total. Men came stumbling out of the smoke, some on fire, all disoriented. They weren't retreating to secondary positions. They were fleeing in pure panic, weapons forgotten, training gone. Mitchell and the other riflemen cut them down as they emerged. Some Japanese soldiers tried to return fire, shooting wildly, their movements jerky and desperate. Others just ran toward the jungle, diving into vegetation, anything to escape the fire that had followed them from the cave. Inside that coral maze, 60 men of the 229th Regiment were experiencing something their training had never covered. They'd been taught to endure artillery, to wait out bombardment, to emerge and fight when the shells stopped falling. But this wasn't shells. This was fire that came from a man who walked toward you. Fire that turned corners and filled spaces and consumed oxygen until you couldn't breathe. Some defenders thought it was a gas attack and fumbled for masks that didn't exist. Others believed they were facing some kind of supernatural weapon. American sorcery. Demons made of flame. The words they shouted to each other in those first seconds would later be translated by intelligence officers. Onibi, demon fire. Jigoku no Akuma, demons from hell. These weren't superstitious peasants. These were trained soldiers, many veterans of China and Malaya. But nothing in their experience had prepared them for a weapon that broke the fundamental rule of combat. That distance provided safety. Artillery you could hear coming. Mortars announced themselves. But this fire appeared from nowhere, carried by a man. Portable hell. Rowe watched through field glasses as the position collapsed. The machine gun went silent. Smoke poured from 3 different openings, meaning the cave system was interconnected exactly as they'd suspected. Bodies lay scattered at the cave mouth and in the approaches. The whole engagement had taken maybe 90 seconds from Davis pulling the trigger to the last Japanese soldier being cut down. 90 seconds to neutralize a position that might have cost them a squad and half a day. Davis scrambled back to the line, fuel gauge showing he'd used 2 liters. Wallace stared at the burning hillside, then at Rowe. "Jesus Christ," was all he said. Rowe was already thinking about the after-action report, about fuel consumption rates and approach distances, and the fact that they'd need to adjust tactics because this weapon changed everything. But mostly, he was thinking about the men who'd come out of those caves on fire, and how the smell would stay with him longer than the tactical success. Over the next 48 hours, they hit 3 more cave complexes using the same method. Each time, the Japanese response was the same: panic, confusion, abandonment of positions that probably could have held against conventional assault. Word was spreading through the Japanese lines. Intercepted radio traffic mentioned fire weapons and warned units to expect new American tactics. The psychological effect was working faster than the actual weapon, but the flamethrowers were revealing serious problems. Fuel consumption was brutal, averaging 2 liters per burst, which pure luck he hadn't fired the weapon before seeing it. Most worrying was the explosion risk. If a bullet hit the fuel tanks, the operator would turn into a fireball. It only took 1 round in the wrong place. The Japanese hadn't figured this out yet. They were too busy panicking, but they would. Rowe knew they would. Every army learned, adapted, developed countermeasures. The window of pure tactical surprise was already closing. Rowe spent his evenings documenting everything in his notebook. He sketched cave layouts, noted wind conditions, recorded fuel mixture ratios and their effects. He wrote down every failure, every near miss, every problem. The weapon needed metal transport cases instead of wooden crates. They needed mobile fuel dumps every 800 meters because resupply was killing them. Operators needed to rotate every 2 engagements because the heat exhaustion and stress were accumulating. He recommended maximum 3 bursts per patrol, strict protocols for checking seals and valves, and doubling up on riflemen for operator protection. By July 25th, intelligence was reporting Japanese countermeasures. Captured documents described new defensive procedures: wet bamboo doors to block fire, escape hatches cut into cave roofs, sandbags soaked in water to line walls, multiple chambers to limit fire spread. Most tellingly, Order 145 from the regimental commander directed that operators of flame weapons are to be prioritized targets regardless of risk to shooters. The Japanese had identified the weak point. Take out the operator before he can discharge, and the weapon is neutralized. The countermeasures showed the Japanese weren't broken, just adapting. Combat was always like this: move and countermove, each side learning from the other. The flamethrower psychological edge would fade as defenders got used to it, developed protocols, stopped seeing it as demon magic, and started seeing it as just another weapon. But for now, in these early weeks, the fear remained their biggest asset. Late August brought the offensive against Munda Point, the main Japanese airstrip in the region. The terrain was worse than anything they'd encountered. Swampy lowland that swallowed equipment, reduced movement to a crawl, turned simple tasks into exhausting labor. Moving fuel forward meant hand-carrying 70% of the canisters because vehicles bogged down in the mud. Rowe watched engineers and native auxiliaries hauling 5-gallon containers through waist-deep water, the whole supply chain held together by human backs and determination. 3 days before the main assault, disaster struck. A fuel canister leaked in the supply dump, gasoline pooling under 2 tents. Someone lit a cigarette or dropped something hot. Nobody ever figured out exactly what. The explosion killed 1 Marine instantly and wounded 4 others. 2 tents full of supplies went up, including 8 flamethrower fuel tanks that cooked off like bombs. The fire burned for 20 minutes, turning night into day, probably visible from the Japanese lines. Rowe suspended flamethrower operations immediately. He pulled every tank, every seal, every valve for inspection. Found 3 more leaks, 2 loose fittings, 1 cracked fuel line that would have split under pressure. The weapon was temperamental, and the tropical environment was destroying it faster than maintenance could keep up. He reorganized the entire system. New inspection protocols, mandatory double checks before every patrol, 3-burst limit per engagement, designated inspection teams, temperature monitoring, shade storage for all fuel. Wallace argued to resume operations. They were behind schedule and taking casualties. Rowe refused. "We lose more men to accidents than to effective fire," he told the lieutenant. "I won't send them out carrying bombs that I know will fail." It was the closest Rowe ever came to insubordination. Wallace backed down, partly because he'd seen the explosion, partly because he'd learned Rowe knew what he was talking about. They spent 2 days refitting and retraining before getting clearance to resume. September 3rd, 0600 hours, they went back into action. 3 operators, Davis, Chen, and Morrison, backed by 9 riflemen with Browning automatic rifles. The target was a fortified position connected to the main Japanese bunker network defending Munda. Intelligence said 40 defenders, interconnected firing positions, clear fields of fire covering the approach. It was the kind of nut that would normally require artillery prep, airstrike, frontal assault. Instead, Rowe planned a 3-point simultaneous attack, hitting different entrances to split the defenders and prevent organized withdrawal. Davis took the main entrance. Chen hit the eastern vent. Morrison circled to the western approach. On Rowe's signal, all 3 opened up at once. The effect was devastating. Fire poured into the bunker complex from 3 directions, filling chambers, consuming oxygen, creating confusion. Japanese soldiers had maybe 10 seconds to decide, burn or run. Most ran. They came out of secondary exits, choking on smoke, some on fire, none organized. The BAR teams cut them down methodically. Inside of 10 minutes, the position was taken. 40 defenders, 11 survivors, all in shock. None had been able to mount coordinated resistance. The fire had broken them psychologically before the riflemen broke them physically. Among the captured documents was a letter from a Japanese sergeant to his family. Intelligence translated it. The Americans have brought mouths that vomit fire. They descend through the jungle like ghosts. When the flame enters the earth, all courage leaves men's hearts. We are taught to face death with honor, but how do you face fire that seeks you in the darkness? The systematic introduction of flamethrowers changed everything about jungle warfare. Within 2 weeks, every combat engineer company on New Georgia had operators and fuel. Battalion Logistics designated 12 reserve tanks, 6 trained men, formal protocols for transport and storage. Engineers began calculating interior volume and ventilation requirements for caves. After 15 seconds of sustained fire, the oxygen was gone, and the space became uninhabitable through heat and smoke, even if flames never touched you. The tactical impact was measurable and immediate. Pre-flamethrower. The average time to neutralize a fortified cave position was 45 minutes, with casualties averaging 3 to 4 Marines per position. Post-flamethrower, average time dropped to 12 minutes, with casualties under 1 per position. The math was brutal but clear. The weapon worked. It saved American lives. It shortened engagements. It reduced the advantage of prepared defenses. But the accident rate remained stubbornly high. 1 in 10 operations ended with some kind of incident. Fuel leaks, burns, internal explosions, ignition failures at critical moments. Operators lasted an average of 4 engagements before requesting rotation due to exhaustion, heat stress, or psychological strain. Several developed what doctors called combat fatigue, but what everyone recognized as something more specific: the weight of being the Marine who burned people alive for a living. The Japanese response continued evolving. Fortifications became more dispersed, less concentrated in fixed positions. They developed flooding systems for some tunnels, triggering them when they heard the characteristic roar of the flamethrower. The most effective countermeasure was hanging explosives from tunnel ceilings, rigged to detonate when the incoming fire heated the air above a certain temperature. It was crude, but worked, sometimes collapsing tunnels on advancing Marines. Despite countermeasures, the psychological edge persisted. Intelligence reports through the fall of 1943 documented mass surrenders at the mere sound of flamethrowers, abandonment of intact positions, declining morale among Japanese infantry units facing Marine combat engineers. A captured diary from October read, "We are not afraid to die for the Emperor, but we are afraid of the demon fire. When it enters our fortifications, Bushido cannot protect us. Our courage fails. This shames us, but it is true." By November, Rowe had compiled enough field data for a comprehensive manual. He was transferred to Espiritu Santo, the rear area training facility, to systematize everything they'd learned through trial, error, and casualties. The assignment probably saved his life. The rest of his squad went to Bougainville, where Davis died when a fuel tank split during combat. Chen lost both legs to a mine, and Morrison was killed by a sniper who'd learned to target flamethrower operators first. At Espiritu Santo, Rowe turned combat experience into doctrine. He compiled a 68-page provisional manual covering every aspect of flamethrower operations, from fuel mixing to maintenance to tactical employment. The section on common failures ran to 12 pages and documented 27 recurring problems with solutions. He included diagrams showing proper approach angles, safe distances, clearing patterns, withdrawal routes. There was a whole chapter on preventing accidents, requiring observers position 10 meters behind operators with fire extinguishers and authority to cut fuel flow if they saw leaks. The manual was blunt about the weapon's limitations and dangers. Operators were exposed, vulnerable, carrying explosive loads. Fuel consumption was high. Reliability in tropical conditions was marginal at best. Maintenance was constant. Psychological strain on operators was severe. But the manual also included the statistics that justified everything. The reduction in casualties, the improvement in efficiency, the tactical flexibility it provided. Cold numbers, each one representing lives saved or lost, positions taken or not taken. Field Manual Flamethrower Operations No. 1 was published in March 1944, incorporating Rowe's work along with lessons from other theaters. It became standard issue for combat engineer units throughout the Pacific. The protocols Rowe developed, the inspection routines, the tactical procedures, the safety requirements were now official doctrine. Marines on Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima would follow procedures he'd written, carrying weapons he'd helped troubleshoot, using tactics refined through trial and error in the jungles of New Georgia. Meanwhile, Japanese defensive doctrine continued adapting. Intelligence tracked the evolution through captured orders and interrogations. Fortifications became deeper, with multiple sealed chambers and compartments designed to limit fire spread. Tunnel networks included intentional dead ends to trap fire. Some positions were deliberately flooded and maintained underwater to prevent flame penetration. The desperate creativity of soldiers trying to survive showed in every innovation. But even as the Japanese adapted physically, the psychological impact remained. A December 1943 intelligence assessment estimated that in close jungle terrain, the mere sound of a flamethrower igniting reduced initial defensive resistance by 40%. Surrender rates tripled. Defenders abandoned positions that purr. The weapon was still effective, but now it was the fear of the weapon doing as much damage as the weapon itself. Rowe received an official commendation for his work and never mentioned it to anyone. He requested return to frontline duty and was denied. Too valuable as an instructor. Too much knowledge to risk. He spent the rest of the war training men, watching them ship out to islands whose names he recognized from radio reports, wondering how many would come back. Whether the procedures he'd written would keep them alive or just make their deaths more efficient. The war ended in August 1945. Rowe went home to Kansas in October, received an honorable discharge, and took a job with the County Highway Department as a civil engineer. He married in 1947, had 3 children, built a modest house on the edge of town. He never joined veteran organizations, never talked much about the war. When asked directly, he'd say he was an engineer in the Pacific. Leave it at that. The flamethrower chapter stayed closed. But it followed him in small ways. He couldn't stand the smell of gasoline, would pay someone else to pump gas into his truck. He kept a fire extinguisher in every room of his house, changed batteries and smoke detectors monthly, taught his children fire safety with an intensity that puzzled them. Once, watching a neighbor burn yard waste, he had to go inside, hands shaking, sweat on his forehead, his wife asking what was wrong. He said it was nothing. Just the heat. Years later, a military historian researching Pacific combat operations tracked him down. They'd found his field reports, his provisional manual, letters of commendation. They wanted to interview him, maybe write an article. Rowe declined. When pressed, he finally said, "It was a tool. Like any tool, it did a job." But tools don't remember. I do. I remember the men who operated those things, the weight they carried, and I don't mean pounds. I remember the Japanese soldiers who came out of those caves. I remember thinking we were saving American lives, and we were. But we were also burning people. That's what it was. And calling it tactics or doctrine or necessary doesn't change what it was. The historian asked if he regretted his work. Rowe thought for a long time. No, he said finally. It saved lives. Marine lives. That mattered. But I also don't think anyone should celebrate it or want to do it again or think it was anything but terrible necessity. The tool saved lives at the cost of the souls of the men who used it. That was the trade. We made it, and we lived with it, and that's all there is to say. The historian didn't write the article, said he couldn't find the right angle. The hero's journey wasn't there. Rowe was glad. He wasn't a hero. He was a Kansas farm kid who knew how to fix things and got good at breaking them when the country needed breaking done. The war made him useful, made him necessary, and when it was over, it let him go back to building roads and raising kids and trying to forget the smell of burning fuel. Calvin Rowe died in 1987 at age 68, pneumonia complicated by years of smoking. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his service as a Marine combat engineer in the Pacific, his 3 decades with the Highway Department, his surviving family. It didn't mention flamethrowers or manuals or the doctrine he'd helped create. Most people at the funeral had no idea he'd contributed to military history. But on islands scattered across the Pacific, his legacy endured in ways both visible and invisible. Memorials to Marine combat engineers included small markers made from empty fuel canisters, names scratched into metal, silent testimony to men who'd carried fire into dark places, veterans who'd survived because someone with a flamethrower cleared a bunker before they had to assault it, never knew Rowe's name, but benefited from procedures he'd written. Japanese survivors carried memories of Onibi and Jigoku no Akuma, demon fire and hell's demons, words that stuck long after the war ended. The statistics told part of the story. Flamethrower-equipped units reduced fortified position neutralization time by 70% throughout the island campaign. Casualty rates among attacking infantry dropped by 60% when flamethrowers were available for cave clearing. The weapon's introduction forced fundamental changes in Japanese defensive doctrine, dispersing forces and abandoning the concentrated bunker systems that had been so effective early in the war. By the numbers, it was one of the most successful tactical innovations of the Pacific Theater. But statistics didn't count the other costs. Operator trauma rates remained classified for decades. Accident reports documented burns, explosions, psychological casualties. The men who carried the flamethrowers, who walked toward enemy positions knowing they were the priority target, who pulled triggers and watched fire pour into caves and heard what came after. They carried weights no manual measured. In military schools, the introduction of portable flamethrowers became a case study in rapid field adaptation, how combat experience drove doctrinal change, how technical innovation could shift tactical balance. The specifics of New Georgia and the name Calvin Rowe rarely appeared in these lessons, but the principles he documented became foundational. Modern infantry doctrine on assault procedures, urban warfare, and clearing fortified positions traced lineage back to those humid weeks in 1943 when Marines first carried fire into coral caves. The Japanese perspective entered the historical record slowly through captured documents, post-war interviews, and memoirs published decades later. Veterans described the flamethrower as the weapon that broke Bushido, not because it killed more effectively than other weapons, but because it triggered something primal, Artillery you could endure stoically. Bullets you could face with courage. But fire coming through tunnel systems, seeking you in darkness, consuming oxygen, turning your fortress into an oven. That broke something fundamental in the defenders' psychology. The shame they felt at this fear haunted some for life. Perhaps the truest memorial came in 1978, when the Marine Corps Historical Division compiled a classified study on weapons development in World War II. In a section on flamethrowers, they concluded, technical specifications alone cannot explain the weapon's effectiveness. Psychological impact, amplified by enemy inexperience and cultural factors, created effects disproportionate to physical capabilities. The weapon worked as much by reputation as by function, a rare case where fear preceded reality and sustained effectiveness even after countermeasures reduced physical threat. Below that clinical assessment, someone had written a margin note later included in the published version. But someone still had to carry it, still had to pull the trigger, still had to live with what happened next. Statistics measure effects. They don't measure costs. The note wasn't attributed, but archivists found it in the same file that contained Rowe's original field reports, his provisional manual, and a photograph of a young sergeant standing beside an M22 flamethrower, face neutral, eyes already old. The weapon that terrified became the weapon that won battles. The Marines who carried it became the Marines who came home changed. The Japanese who faced it became survivors with nightmares. The engineer who systematized it became a county worker who didn't talk about the war. These were the human elements beneath doctrine, the truth behind tactical innovation, the cost of effectiveness measured not in fuel consumption or casualty reduction, but in dreams interrupted and memories that wouldn't fade. On Bougainville and New Guinea and Saipan and Iwo Jima, when Marines advanced with flamethrowers toward fortified positions, they followed procedures that came from those first desperate experiments on New Georgia. They checked seals that Rowe had redesigned, used fuel ratios he'd calculated, approached at distances he'd determined optimal, withdrew using patterns he'd documented. His work, anonymous and uncelebrated, kept some of them alive. The Japanese defenders who surrendered rather than face the fire, who abandoned positions at the weapon's roar, who spent decades afterward remembering the smell and heat and terror. They never knew one man's methodical documentation had turned an experimental weapon into systematic doctrine. To them, it remained demon fire, American sorcery, the thing that broke their courage when artillery couldn't. The mythology persisted because the reality was too technical, too mundane. A farm kid from Kansas who understood machines and took careful notes made better ghost story as a demon than as an engineer. But demons don't write manuals. Demons don't test fuel ratios or redesign seals or document failure modes. Demons don't stay up at night worrying about the men who'll carry the weapon tomorrow. Demons don't go home and spend 40 years building roads and teaching their children fire safety and quietly carrying the weight of having helped perfect a weapon that burned people alive, even if it saved lives doing it. The Japanese were wrong. The Marines weren't demons. They were men doing a job that required fire in a war that required winning, for a country that required both, and tried not to think too hard about the cost. And Calvin Rowe, who helped make that job more efficient and less lethal to the Marines who performed it, understood better than anyone that you could make all the right technical decisions, save all the lives statistics could measure, and still carry something that weighed more than any flamethrower ever manufactured. In the end, the legacy wasn't demon fire or hell's demons or any of the mythology that grew around a weapon that scared an enemy. The legacy was 70% improvement in efficiency, 60% reduction in friendly casualties, and one man's quiet certainty that necessary and right weren't always the same thing, but sometimes they had to be good enough.